things was never fair. I'd rather be this starving artist, experience life now at its farthest. One blue sky, we are under, torn and shred now, ripped asunder. The politics, war and famine. I thank God I'm still here jamming. Train your mind.
Early morning today, driving around from the job site, and got enlisted to go out and get nourishment and refreshment for everybody who's kicking their ass working on this construction job. And I'm driving around, and it's like every once in a while you got to turn on the news. You got to reconnect so that you're with the current flow of things, and you're not like somebody that people stumble upon and they're like, whoa, you're like an antique, like how disconnected have you actually been, sort of thing. So I turn it on, hear about this Barcelona thing that's going on. Type in Barcelona attacks today. We got CNN. And every time that I actually tune into the news stations and I hear about terror and all of this political disarray, my mind always connects or is drawn towards what I was taught in high school in my AP Lit class when we had to read the book 1984. So let's take a look at some George Orwell 1984 quotes. Until they became conscious, they will never rebel. And until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. George Orwell, 1984. I always just refer back to this, where the political system in the book always just creates this hopeless and fearful state of the world, and this chaotic sense of things to actually keep the people and the public in a state of fear. And they actually utilize these groups to actually enlist more control and power over the citizens when they are supposedly really portraying an enemy. They actually use the enemy to their own advantage. For example, how many things are going on at the world at this moment? How many good things are going on? How much could we actually talk about which is contradictory to terror, to chaos, and to all of these negative aspects of political disarray? Literally, there's an immense amount of information and things going on simultaneously, but for some reason it always seems that the negative side of things is portrayed and it is megaphoned in front of our eyes and to our ears more so than anything good that's going on. Now, why is that? Because evil things are always happening, but should that then make us actually just ignore the fact that they're going on? I don't necessarily think so, but I do think that there's something wrong when literally every time you turn on the news stations, that's what is being purported. That's what is being reported on all of the time. It's not necessarily that it's like, there's a major event that happened and let's just report on that. No, it's literally every single time it's all this negativity that's being thrown around and literally just perpetuated through the system. And so what it is, it's just like within the book. It utilizes this fear tactic to instill fear upon the viewers, the listeners, and all of these other things, because it just places you in more of a zone of control for the higher ups, the people that are really puppeting the scene. War itself isn't won through bullets. It's won through informational and through telecommunication networks, and also through resource linkage and destroy of this linkage through resources. You don't think that wars are actually started and that they are actually perpetuated for the financial gain of people that are in the higher ups. And you don't think that they utilize all of this control and media to actually instill fear so that people don't
rise up against the system, because then they say that you yourself are acting in accordance with these terrorist groups. So literally they're just utilizing this perpetuation of negativity to actually harbor more slavery and to actually infringe upon your rights as somebody who can protest against what's going on, and actually limit the amount of what you can do within life without being designated as a terrorist and somebody who's against the state, an anarchist. And so they utilize all of this to their own advantage. Now, because we know that all of these things could be won if they were to literally just, disconnect all of their media outlet, and if we were to literally ignore, and if we were to destroy the telecommunication networks of all these negative entities, then literally they could be put into disarray and destroyed easily as that. Wars aren't won with bullets, and wars aren't really started with bullets. They are started by people with political and financial interests, and it's more of economical matters. And if you think that picking up a weapon and loading bullets in it is going to actually stop the war and actually bring in a reign of peace, then you're going to be missing the target that you're shooting at. You need to be picking up some of this social network ammunition and some of this telecommunications and economical and financial ammunition, and realize that the wars are actually being perpetuated, and it's being utilized to keep people in a state of fear, to keep people in a state of warlike behaviors, to just perpetuate the whole military industrialized complex, to just keep people working for the system. And the more that people are not allowed to think about what's going on, and the more enslaved they actually are, the less time they have to think and to actually reason and logically come to conclusions about what is really happening, and why we aren't hearing about all the positive and good things that are going on around the world, between every single race, between every single ethnicity, geographical areas, and everything to that extent. But people don't have the time to question and to come to these conclusions, because they're kept in this constant state of disarray. And if they try to actually instill in others the notion to break away from this state of confusion and hypnosis, then they are actually then deemed by the state as something which is harmful to the state. And so then they actually utilize all this negative information which is being perpetuated to actually keep the system in check. And if you guys can't see that, then you really need to look back upon your great professors and teachers who tried to instill all these universal ideas within your mind, because in a lot of ways they went against what was actually scripted for them to teach within their classes, and they were kind of taking a little bit of a risk going away from the written code book or manual teaching transcripts that they were required to actually perpetuate in the system to maintain the system for the sake of the system. And these were good teachers, and a lot of people really need to take the time and to sit down and think, okay, there's 8 billion people on the planet. How come I'm not hearing about other things? It's a tragedy that I heard on the news. So there's reports of 54 to possibly 1 dead, and that's the current news. Okay, in regards to 8 billion people, it might be a little bit harsh for me to say this, but isn't there other things that we could report on? And if we actually report on all these positive things, don't you think that it's going to literally choke out the weeds of these terrorist groups? Because they're not receiving any light. Even a weed needs light to grow. And if you actually close off the ability for it to receive light, then it's going to die just like anything else. So why don't we actually flourish our state, flourish the state of humanity, by allowing people more freedom, by focusing on the big picture here, and not necessarily giving these people the media time that they actually don't deserve and shouldn't be given. Let's grow some beautiful plants, some beautiful fruitful trees, but for that to actually happen, we have to give light to the fruit and to the good things in the world, not necessarily perpetuate this state of fear, which literally just perpetuates itself and becomes this exponential beast out of our control, manifesting itself as a superorganism, which then protects itself through all the mechanisms that I just described. Anyways, gotta get back to work, folks, because that's what it's all about. Exactly what I'm talking about.
now all this jazz is going down regarding the Southern General statues being torn down. And then we got this conversation happening. Anybody still defending this shit show, you should let me know. I like to keep far from the mentally ill. Talking about Trump. And then so I come in and comment. People still think the Confederate flag is a symbol of patriotism, though. It makes me wonder if they had an entirely different history lesson. And this is then where I post one of my earlier videos on slavery. It's been around longer than you think and still persists today. And I say a government entity requesting absolute servitude from its citizens isn't going to teach you doctrine that instills defection. Some things contrary to popular belief actually represent a more grand perspective of freedom for more rather than slaves of many. The conversation then escalates quite quickly when I then state, are people really that ignorant about the Civil War and what it was really about? Those statues represent more of a battle for the states' rights and a less centralized, monopolized federation, to name a few things. Lincoln really only brought up the slave issue because he saw how it stirred up the press and allowed the swing vote in his favor. And anybody who thinks he was a black man supporter obviously hasn't read or heard his own talks about the black race. And this then escalates the whole conversation quite a bit. I post this video titled Abraham Lincoln, What They Won't Teach You in School, which you can look up. And then we go into this big old discussion. We have this gentleman here named Cole Boydston, who then quotes a few passages from the video, this YouTube video. And then I liken one of his comments to where Hercules goes to petition to Zeus, the king of the gods, and he is sitting upon the throne. And it's eerily familiar to the Lincoln Memorial. And then we have the original Post entity, Marky McLean, actually commenting. I'm way more concerned at the downplay of the Nazi white supremacist groups by our president. There are not two sides to this, point blank. People counter-protesting Nazis that are carrying tiki torches like they're headed to burn the witch at the stake are in no way comparable to Nazis. It's mind-blowing how that's even fathomable to some people, let alone the guy that's supposed to lead us. They think they have a friend in Trump. That is a huge problem. You have to watch the whole video to see all the comments, not just the GW statement, George Washington statement, which I still don't agree with. I think putting the Confederates in the same category as Lincoln, George Washington is insulting to all they did. How the F do you compare men who create this nation and all the things, the right to hold on to dearly, with the men that only fought for Confederacy, the right to own other people, which ultimately isn't what the war was about, which I then state. Even if they were all slave owners, these guys did very different things, and this will never be a legitimate argument to me. Here is an amazing metaphor for the simple-minded that don't understand the ignorance coming from his mouth. Me, I'm guessing. Sure, the cancer was aggressive, but the chemotherapy was also very aggressive. There was aggression on both sides. So, then I state, if the cancer doesn't kill you, life will. The reason he downplays the groups is because he realizes, like you don't, that these groups saw the opportunity to make a scene for their cause when the actual part in the play was about something else, which he sees. In case we're missing the point here, Washington and Jefferson worked to unite the nation. The Confederates worked to do the exact opposite. The slave owner argument is still wrong. How do you think a leader back then would have fared against slavery when it was literally the norm? Doesn't mean they were for it. In fact, Washington did oppose it secretly, and he wrote a will emancipating his slaves before he died. He educated them and set them free, a little different than putting your whole life's work toward keeping the right to own another person. Jefferson owned a lot, even had kids with one, if I remember correctly. He also wrote a law banning the importation of African slaves and openly shamed slavery, but that wasn't because he believed in racial equality. It was because he literally believed even the black slaves weren't good enough to exist in the U.S. He wanted to ship them all out. Washington and Jefferson were pretty different on the topic, but despite their opposition on slavery, they did the shaping that led to uniting the nation. Can you say the same about the Confederate leaders? So, ultimately, she's hiding that she's actually really, like, pro that the statues of these Confederate leaders should be taken down. And then she goes on to state, yeah, Austin Hyde, that makes about as much sense as he does, and now I can see why you justify it. She's talking about my statement earlier here where I said, if cancer doesn't kill you, life will. And this is in reference to her gif from cancer and chemotherapy, which I totally understood, but I made the whole jest just literally pointless by this one statement. I'll explain in a little bit. So then we go on. Final thought before I decide to go to something productive. The statues are an important part of our history, but they shouldn't stand in public. They should be saved and taken to a museum. Understand that so many uneducated people see them and think, oh my God, we're memorializing racism and slavery right in the middle of our city. Not everybody is lucky enough or cares to be educated on what each Confederate man did. The majority of these statues have no written background with them, so people really don't know anything except that they spent their lives fighting for slavery. Happy medium, don't destroy the statues, but move on where they belong, in a museum with all the background info possible at the end. So she's kind of backtracking here a little bit, but she still is missing the point that what I was arguing before was that it necessarily wasn't about slavery. It was about the right for them to govern themselves, and slavery was a side issue, which ultimately the North and Lincoln himself didn't actually want to abolish. He only used it as a swing vote. Like I state, Lincoln really only brought up the slave issue because he saw how it stirred up the press and allowed the swing vote in his favor. So she doesn't realize that the statues don't represent slavery and them fighting for slavery. It was the right for them to govern themselves and be like an acting government body, which can still have a connection and correlation to the Union, but not a totalitarian, monopolized, centralized government system. So anyways, then I go on to say this. So the reason that I still see that it could have been connected and that the South was fighting for union, but also rights, was through this ideology. That's because I pursued a degree in biology, and you didn't study this. This was me being a little bit of an arse and just saying that I'm more qualified to talk about the matter because I studied life, which entails literally every facet of life, including politics. So anyways, I say that, and then I say this to actually support what I said: if cancer doesn't kill you, then life will. Every movement of your body actually destroys your body. The motion of life is furthering your experience of it towards death, but the notion of death is what gives us life, for without death we wouldn't know what life was. Death gives us life, but ultimately everything must die to live. Ergo, life is killing you, so who gives two issues about cancer when we dive into the realm of infinite eternities and the logical paradox is required for us to experience the sensations of life? You do realize that unification can be wrought by means of division, right? The chaotic entanglement of a landscape is what actually connects the flow of energy and information throughout it. Though it may seem for an instant that it consists of separate entities, it functions as a whole. The landscape is made up of multitudes of organisms, which are individuals, but ultimately the landscape itself is a living and acting superorganism, like your body composed of organs and cells, and within the cells, organelles. We can further compound this whole discussion into a hierarchy of pretty much chaotic things which don't seem like they're a part of a whole, but they are. which is how the South could still be a part of the Union, even if they did ultimately win the right to govern themselves and to literally establish their own form of currency and government and all of these other facets. And it didn't necessarily have to fall into what everybody pretty much like just compiles it with slavery and racism from the very beginning, when ultimately it's about a lot more issues than that. To put it bluntly, there were statues that were being torn down of Confederates by people who are advocates against slavery and racism, when the statues actually represent freedom from oppression, the right to govern themselves, which the South pursued. Eventually, due to social norms, the form of slavery back then would have been burnt out anyways, but instead, a worse form of slavery became instilled through the centralized and monopolized form of government, or totalitarianism, which came about. And that video of Abe Lincoln actually describes that in more whole than me just saying it in a couple sentences. The whole scene was hijacked back then to be something of race and of slavery, as it is now being hijacked today. And literally, people are actually feeding and they are actually promoting this hijacked theory of what's going on to literally just create a diversion from the real issues at hand. Extremist groups came in and started protesting because they saw an opportunity. Then it became a whole race thing again, which in fact the Civil War wasn't about either. A union can exist beyond totalitarian monopolization of all states and their rights. And then I just try to be a peacemaker and I say, peace, thanks for the discussion, apologies if you don't see it the way I do, have a good day. And then we kiss and make up. I can appreciate an educated discussion, my name, and contrary to popular belief, those on opposite sides can listen and learn from each other. No harm, no foul, dude. And then I go in to say this. I just wish I could have went down there with a big A microphone and had skin as strong as Superman, so I could say, look, you dumb mother effers, these statues are here as a reminder to the fact that total government control and fascism is not what this union should progress towards. The people who died fighting against their brothers didn't do so because they wanted your ancestors as their slaves to do all their work. These statues serve as a reminder to help us find some middle ground, along with Lincoln sitting on his throne, which ultimately, ideally, will propel the Union into a greater union. While still retaining enough rights for everyone, we can all have a sense of self, while feeling a part of the whole as well. Making this ish about race is pissing me off, and what makes me think that there should be a totalitarian government control, like so many leaders eventually come outright into speaking, is because people do stupid ish like this, and then the leaders are like, what? So Zeus said to Prometheus, don't give them fire because they will eventually burn us down and burn themselves down with it. And now Lincoln sits on the throne like Zeus. And then literally, I collapse my whole argument because I just take it there to the point in which you can't handle all of this stuff at once. Literally, you can collapse this whole argument and go off onto all these other rails and trains of thought in regards to society and government action. And so I just take it there to make the whole thing pointless on purpose. So yeah, I think I made myself look like an idiot, but one time in school I was actually given credit for playing the fool, and all I had to do was walk around and act like an idiot. Everyone has their part to play, and I'd rather speak than citing the ever-present argument that what can be said has been said, so remain quiet. The cancer jest you stated was about picking the better of two evils and saying that both sides were aggressive when the choice should be obvious. And I'm guessing you are paralleling it to something that someone said politically about there being aggression on both sides of the situation down south or something, when the choice about who the true enemy is should be obvious. Also, I'm going now to collapse my whole argument in one fell swoop, because ultimately, I do think the war was about slavery. If we go as far as to say that the slave owners were merely postulating the fact that government control is in actuality, certain senses, slavery over its citizens, depending on the type of government, and we will parallel government institutions with business and corporate entities acting as pseudo-governments. They in turn wanted to institute by separation their own governmental rule and have the right to have their own slaves, or citizens, and be business monarchs to a certain degree, rather than bowing down to a higher power and authority than themselves, represented through unification. And we have the whole saying like join or die. That was a little bit earlier, but still was probably still purported during this, fight as one or die as many type of thing, showing us how complex the discussion really is and isn't black and white, and now can even go down roads of private enterprise versus government corporation, centralized banking versus multitude, privatized and competitive or monopolized and centralized, and where truly is the difference when private enterprises pull the strings of government behind the curtains anyways. Screw it. And then this guy comes in to say one more thing, Cole Boydston. So, going back now to acting like an idiot and playing the part of an idiot. I played the part of an idiot and ultimately got a lot more likes out of it. We'll see here on my post. Lately, I've been a fan of McDonald's flat burgers. It's like when I eat anywhere else, they give me burgers that I can't fit in my mouth. And everything falls out all over the place. And you eat it, you need a knife and fork. And to eat it, you need a knife and fork. Thanks, McDonald's. You got what's required on it to call it what it is, while allowing me to comfortably eat it without struggling or being required to utilize fancy contraptions. And then we have the picture of me eating my dinner tonight while I was on the job site. Everything tastes good when you've literally worked a 13, 14-hour day.
Need hammer and I need nails. Awesome. Hammer nails. Hammer nails.
Everything's all jacked up.
I need hammer and nails.
So I post that, all of a sudden look at all these likes that I get. Now, I post something politically incisive. This was a lot earlier than that. Anybody defending the people who are tearing down the statues are only showing to the world that they are in fact ignorant of what they really stand for. You think that they represent symbols of slavery or racism, you're wrong. They actually represent the ability to courageously oppose oppression. The Civil War was about individual rights, and the parties representing their neighborhood states, the neighborhoods, versus the right of a corporation to impose laws based upon its own financial interests through a centralized, monopolized federation, in which the outcome actually caused more people to be slaves than were slaves at the time. The North and the leader Lincoln never actually held the black man in high regard. Look at what was actually said, not the watered down version you were taught so long ago to gain your empathy vote, which is exactly what Lincoln did to gain the swing vote because they saw it was needed stance to attack his opponent's moral character rather than actually debating the problem. In my opinion, if the war would have went the other way, slavery in the form which was represented at the time would have been abolished as times progressed, and ultimately the Union would have stood because, like I stated earlier, through the chaotic entanglement of the landscape, it's all connected anyways, and it would have propelled the whole thing into a totally different system than it is now. But what any of you defending these vagrants don't realize is that much worse form of slavery was then manifest. So now I'd like to parallel this into the thought of bread and circus. Bread and circus is a phrase used by a Roman writer to deplore the declining heroism of Romans after the Roman Republic ceased to exist and the Roman Empire began. Two things only the people anxiously desire, bread and circuses. The government kept the Roman populace happy by distributing free food and staging huge spectacles. Now, we're gonna see this right here on my Facebook page. Look at me make this nonsense post about a burger. I mean, it is kind of true. I actually do feel this way about eating the burger and what was actually said about it. Like, the statement is totally true, but I added a little humor to it. I made it kind of funny and witty, and it was something which a lot of people can connect with. You don't have to think too much about it. And I got, like, within posting it, all of a sudden I get all of this stuff, all these likes, all these reactions, whatever. And then I post something really insightful and, that should make you question the way that things have been run, the way that they are running, and all of this stuff likewise, and literally nothing. No comments, nothing. Nobody wants to partake in actually talking about it at all. So there you have it, bread and circus, folks. Enjoy your bread and enjoy the circus. I sure know that I do. Because I went to the circus the other day over at the county fair, and I really actually did enjoy it. Just like I enjoyed my daily bread. Peace out, folks.
When people who are tearing them down don't really understand what they're standing for. They're ignorant to the fact about what the Civil War was actually about. It was about freedom from oppression, freedom from slavery, a greater form of slavery. And anybody who thinks that Abe Lincoln was an advocate for abolishment of slavery obviously isn't familiar with his political tactics, his political viewpoints and standpoints regarding the issue in regards to the quotes and the actual speeches that he gave regarding the black race and of slaves in general. You can actually parallel the viewpoints of Abe Lincoln to that of the story of Prometheus and of Zeus sitting upon the throne, which eerily is familiar to the Lincoln Memorial sitting upon his throne, where in actuality a more prevalent form of slavery came into sight as Lincoln's vision came into being, and a more centralized, monopolized corporation then enslaved the masses rather than people actually being the right to govern themselves.
We got a bunch of quotes from this book here. The most liked quote being, "Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood." Lame.
Fake news. Fake news. Fake news.
Train your mind, now hear my words. Twitter hated little birds. If you've kept up with all my posts, then your life's just like a ghost, already dead in the machine. The screen and life one's in between.